Welcome to the datacenterHawk podcast. Today we're talking about how to measure the data center market. We're talking about how to measure the data center market. So,
yes,
let's talk about this. Like, we got to go from 50,000, 10, to the nitty gritty. But what makes the data center market different than other commercial real estate sectors? I guess.
Yeah, I think there's, and I actually think this is one of the most important podcasts we will do because I know, gosh,
that is a white hot
I
sports
know.
opinion.
I'm sure people are just so much more excited
Don't tease the lead,
to
bro.
listen to this. Yes. No, the reason I say that is I think that this serves, the information that you get when you do this correctly helps the market operate efficiently. So, and I would say that there's two really important things to consider, when you think about like measuring the data center market maybe differently than other commercial real estate types. One is it's really expensive. There's so much capital that goes into data center facilities, et cetera. And then, the other thing too is very nuanced. It's different than your other types of real estate asset classes. So, so why it's important to do it well is because it serves as that basis for so many decisions that are made, where you choose to build the data center facility, how big, what design, there's just, and as the market has matured over time, in my opinion, measuring the space has become really important. It's also very confusing, which I know we'll talk about, because of some of the different challenges with that. So, for those listening, if you think about, traditional like office spaces or retail space, whatever it is, data center sites, facilities are, significantly more expensive because of all of the, UPS systems and generators, all the things that that go into a data center facility to make. So
more expensive on like a per square foot basis, which
Yes.
is how most people just default think about real estate.
Yeah, and the other side of that is all other commercial real estate markets are measured by square footage, where the square footage does not move the data center industry, the power does. And if you can put as much power in a space as you can and cool it, you have there's that many more opportunities in the space. So I think when you boil that down, or when you think about all those things, it makes measuring this market different, but that much more important because of those things.
Yeah, and I think, we have covered this on some of our other data center fundamentals podcasts, but just talk about like why the metric is power. Why is it not square footage?
Yeah. Typically, like, let's just say you had 100,000 square foot building just for data centers being built larger than that, but let's just say 100,000 feet,
It's a good round number.
It is. It is, yes. And that's what we like here at datacenterHawk.
You ever wonder why we ended up on the decimal system and not like the octagonal base 8 system? It's fascinating. A little Google search.
Yeah, I was thinking about that this morning, but
it seems weird to us, but if we were on base 8 forever, it would seem normal.
Yeah.
Base 10 would seem weird. Anyways,
100,000 foot
100K is a good
building.
number.
You traditionally can think that like half of that facility size or 40% is going to go to, of the square footage, is going to go to systems that serve the building. So a lot of those electrical rooms and, sometimes there's like generators inside the facilities, et cetera. So, and then 60% will be served as like at the actual data center rooms or computer rooms that you put the servers in. So you can't say that, and then I would also say like in a lease type scenario. So in the co-location market, the rent is driven off of that 60% of the floor, and it's really the power that's coming into that area. It's not on that square footage. So it's how much power a company is going to reserve to be able to use that is driving the rents in this market. It's not on a square footage basis.
That's another great distinction to make of like kind of access to power capacity versus power used. And I was thinking about this, definitions are really important.
Yeah, they are.
And so, in this place is actually one where it's actually a little bit more analogous to an office, where if you rent a floor of an office building and you only put 20 people in it, we still pay for the floor.
Yes.
But you have access to the whole floor.
There you go.
So that's a nice jumping off point too, on the power side. But what are some of the kind of nuance of that concept in the data center market, like access to the power capacity versus power used?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with companies traditionally will need, or they perceive they need more than they actually use. So there's a lot of what's called stranded capacity in different facilities where, companies are paying to use X, but they're using Y. And so that's part of it, is just understanding don't put that all on, it's not all the company's fault. Sometimes they thought they were going to acquire a company, so they anticipated they would be consolidating more, compute into a location, and it changes. So that's part of it. And then, the electricity costs, or what you pay for your electricity use, is based on the amount of, electricity that you're using. So, and that's on top of the rent traditionally, especially in the larger requirements that are out there today. But that's, that is the key difference when you think about the data center industry and how it functions in the commercial real estate asset class family versus, you mentioned offices. And so it's a distinct difference. And that's why when you measure the market, you really want to understand the data center industry from a power standpoint. You really want to understand the sellable, the commissioned power that is out there, that is available, it's under construction plan, because those are the numbers that would make you look at a market and say, hey, this makes sense for us to go build a data center in this, city, or this city is oversupplied. Mm-hmm. And based on the demand that is out there, it does not appear that this would make sense to go invest $100, $200, $500 million in this area.
Yeah, so you mentioned, let's go back to our 100,000 square foot building example and kind of work outwards from the building in, talking specifically about the power aspect of it, from the substation all the way into, call it the data center rack.
Yep.
And talk about how that power is broken down and how those will fit into, what we would consider the industry's preferred or standard way of talking about power.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing, even before you do that, you really need to understand what type of facility it is, and we actually have a podcast where we go through data center types. And the reason that's important is because that has changed over the last 5 years. So one of the things we talk about a lot is the hyperscale users that are out there in the market today, and they typically can take a whole building, sometimes a whole campus, or sometimes a whole data hall. The data halls we see today are typically anywhere from 20 to 40,000 square feet of data room, and anywhere from 4 to 8 megawatts of power being delivered, commissioned power being delivered to that space for the user to lease. So when they are taking facilities, all of it is designed for one user. But there's certain scenarios where a publicly traded REIT or a privately owned data center operator would say, hey, let's build a facility and we can attract multiple tenants to that, or multiple users, customers to this location, and we call that multi-tenant. The multi-tenant data center space. And so typically when those, facilities are built, you have a substation. Substation delivers, power to the, transformers at the site. The transformers are delivering the power, into the space. There's UPS systems that are, basically backing up the site. You have things like remote power panels that are then delivering, the power into the data rooms. And then you have, PDUs that are PDUs delivering to the remote power panels, the remote power panels delivering it to the cabinets, and the cabinets delivering it to the servers. So that's traditionally how the power goes from big to small.
Yeah. So again, in the 100,000 square foot building example, which you said about 60%, so call it 60,000 square feet, is, call it white space or commissioned data center space.
Critical load.
Yes, critical power. So what would the power, a typical kind of power step down be as you work your way from the substation into the rack? So if there's, maybe it's easier to go backwards. You have 60,000 square feet, maybe kind of 6 to 10 megawatts of power.
Yeah, at least.
What's going to be coming in?
Yeah, typically I would say on a building like that, if you had, 10 megawatts serving the critical space or the commission power area, you'd probably have anywhere from like 17 to 20 serving the building, and that's what we call utility load. How much total power is there, and then how much is serving the actual like site itself.
Yeah, you don't see this as much, but that's an easy way for a data center operator to sort of inflate the importance of their facility by saying in their brochure what the utility power is. This is a 50 megawatt facility. Sounds a lot more impressive than 25 to 30 of the actual IT load that they can support there.
Yeah, and those that are like nerds like we are, tracking the space to the granularity that we are, it's very important, what you don't want to do is get confused when you have a big investment you're about to make and you're going off of those numbers, because those numbers are not correct as it relates to what is being bought and what could be sold in the market. Where there's a lot of, for years we have spent time decoding, brochures and things like that are out there. And I don't, it's not, it's marketing. So you're trying to
it's a little sizzle,
show what you're doing at a grand scale. But it's also important. That's what I've always said in a lot of the conversations I've had with people in our space. It's just much better to be what you are, because if you want the customers to come in, they're going to find out what you are. And in my opinion, it's always better to, present what you are and not surprise anybody, especially with the amount of capital being spent on these decisions. No one likes to be surprised, So
I don't like surprises when I'm buying a candy bar. If it says 2 for $2, I don't want to get up to the register and be like, no, sorry, those were exempt from the 2 for $2 promotion. It's $1.60.
Yeah,
that's weak.
So
$100 million bucks, even more so.
Yes.
Amplify the feeling.
Agree. So that's but it's one of the reasons that there's been confusion around what's going on in space. The other thing is, unfortunately, a lot of the news outlets that cover our space do not get what is really happening when a developer...
Is that a shot fired at MSNBC?
No, not at all. But just when a developer actually breaks ground on a project and the true intent behind it. And I think that if they were able to do that, it would help a lot of the confusion that can be out there. And so I think people that are in the space, if you've been in the industry a long time, certainly aware of this. But if you're just coming into the space, it's important to know that when a data center operator begins to break ground on a project, they are not building 100 megawatts. They might have a substation that could serve that over time that's being built.
Yeah, this is a good development timeline.
Yes, but
rabbit trail. But
yes,
that's,
sorry.
But those are great.
But over time,
over
time, that developer is going to deliver power in a reasonable perspective. This is all about capital being deployed in the market. And, data center operators have gotten, and large hyperscale users that build, own, and operate their own campuses, they know how to deploy capital in a reasonable, manner so they can get the rate of return they need to on the capital.
Yeah, so those are some great diagnostic questions. So in any relationship, marriage is notwithstanding, what do you mean is a great question. So here, 100 megawatts, what do you mean?
Yes.
Is that critical? Is that utility? When will it be delivered?
Is that over 20 years?
Yeah, is that over the next 20 years? Yeah. I think there's some 500 megawatt developments that are just kind of sitting out there. They're hanging.
Sure.
Okay. So that's good. So like I said, definitions are very important.
Yeah.
So one of the things we spend a lot of time here at datacenterHawk is coming up with that overall power number for a market.
Yeah.
So then once again, very important to be specific as far as what's in, what's out.
Yes.
So when you look at a facility by facility basis, it's just the critical load.
Yes.
And then when you're looking at which facilities to include in that number,
yes,
that's very important too. So talk a little bit about what things we include, what things we don't.
Yes.
And then kind of how the industry assesses that.
Okay, 15 years ago,
Gosh, I love it when you go 15 years ago.
And
I love
companies were building, owning, and operating their own data centers more than they were today. Now they have swung to leasing their own facilities, and a lot are using cloud infrastructure, which is a different type of lease, but it for our purposes, that's where we were 15 years ago. So when the market started to change, we stopped tracking that as part of the leasable market, because it's not. The companies that own and operate their own data center, that's what they do.
It's like a private.
Yeah.
We're a bank. We've got 100 servers in a
yes.
room somewhere, probably closet floor, whatever
yes.
the case may be. We typically ignore those.
Right.
For probably two reasons. One, really hard to get that information.
Yeah.
Two,
it's not part of the market that's really
it's not
moving.
leasable.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so we basically are tracking, multi-tenant data center, the multi-tenant data center market. Hyperscale is included, in that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really important to understand. I mean, basically, like, what is your universe, and what facilities fall under that, and then how do you track those? I mean, we do it on a quarterly basis. Every facility, every market, in the U.S., Europe, and now we've got 3 markets in Asia that we're tracking, and more to come. But that's a really important part of what it is. Also, to the understanding like the critical power in those facilities, and we do it in 4 different categories. What's commissioned, so what's actually been delivered out of that commission, what's available. So we have a vacancy rate based off of commissioned power in the market. What's under construction, what amount of commission capacity is going to be delivered and what is under construction, and then what is planned down the road. So planned projects that data center operators have either communicated on or are in the permitting process, et cetera, in a market. So we have those 4 metrics in every market that we track every quarter.
Yeah, so I think that it just underscores, when we say the Dallas market is, whatever it is, 385 from memory. You know better than I would, roughly.
I would say it's between that and 400.
Okay. So that number, and that's what everybody wants to that's the headline.
Yeah.
And then the detail is, here's what's included, here's what's not.
Yes.
And here's when we define a power number, there's what's in and what's not.
Now,
go ahead.
I was just going to say one more thing. The one thing that we don't include in that, which we're starting to think through down the road on how to cover, is powered shell development. So, was that on the list?
That's where I was going next.
Oh, I just stole your thunder, bro.
I
Sorry.
had this really awesome segue. I was going to segue like I was on a Segway. That's how good of a segue it was going to be.
Well,
great product name.
Beat you to it. So these are, buildings that the developer will build basically the shell and then lease the facility in a different format than they would a traditional like multi-tenant data center. And then the user, the customer, comes in and actually pays for all of the UPS systems and generators, and they control that process in conjunction with the developer. But what I think is important is that that part of the market is growing more now than it has been over the last 4 to 5 years. We saw, I would say between 2008 to 2012, we probably saw more capital invested in those type of projects than kind of a wilderness period, the powered shell wilderness. And then I would say in
the wandering.
Yeah, 2018 on, we started to see.
Is that the promised land now of
yes,
powered shell development?
Yes.
Great.
Some of the larger data center users want more customized facilities in this manner, and so it's allowed for more development to take place there. So I think that's an important thing to note. But I would just say, like, when you hear of a market being bigger than another market or whatever it might be, it's always important to understand what is in the universe of that.
Yeah, it's a market that frequently kind of gets people sideways is Dublin.
Yes.
They have got a great PR department in Dublin.
They do.
And they're always touting what they're doing from a data center, from a sustainability standpoint, from the power. It's great. But they're publicized this huge number. I was like 700 megawatts. It's massive.
Yes.
Where in reality, like a much smaller subset of that is what we would consider as like the multi-tenant market.
But
a lot of hyperscale companies are setting up shop there.
But what you've seen is like a significant amount of growth from 4 or 5 very large companies. And so if I'm them, I would probably do the same thing too, which is showing all the capital that's flowing into here, because the definitions to probably a economic development group or people that are trying to attract others are a lot less important, because they're trying to talk about how big the market is. But to us, if you don't understand that and you're in our position or others that are talking about the market, when you're saying different markets are bigger or smaller than others, it's just very important that you define, in my opinion, it's very important that you define the universe for the people that are reading.
Yeah. Now, if you're a construction company, or you sell servers or racks or what have you, like, you really don't care.
That's right.
It's a lot.
That's right.
What I mean?
Because the more opportunities, better.
And so different people can have their own definitions, but
absolutely,
datacenterHawk as a company is typically focused on the multi-tenant. So that's once you kind of have your definitions hammered out which I feel like we've done a good job of. Thank you. The other thing that's important to understand is like how that power capacity amount changes over time. So talk a little bit about how do we measure that?
Yeah.
There's some wrinkles there as well, as you might imagine. Measuring those changes over time, which is really some of the probably the important metric for understanding, how different markets are growing or less or more. So talk about that.
Well, one of the trends that has taken place in the industry over the last, several years has been a more defined way of building for each data center operator. Meaning, if a data center operator has a program that they're building in Chicago that fits on a site, they're going to try and it works and it's efficient. They want to try and execute that same project in Dallas or Phoenix or Northern Virginia most of the time. So the way they build their lineups, how much power they deliver to each amount of data room or data center space, that's pretty standard. So, traditionally, if we understand that there's a site that will be a data center down the road, we're going to understand how much critical power can be delivered at that site. So let's say it was 72 megawatts, and we would put it in the planned category. And then if the first phase kicks off and we know they're building 2 9-megawatt data halls, we will bring 18 megawatts into the under construction category, which leaves, whatever 72 minus 18 would be. Is that 54?
54.
We are math majors here. 54 megs in the planned power. And then once it's delivered, and it's ready to be leased, we would put that 18 megs into the commissioned category, and it becomes 18 megawatts available. That's another thing is you could talk to 5 different data center operators, and they could all say they have 5 megawatts available, and they all mean something different. And so
but important to note that very few, if any, operators are just bringing on 18 megawatts capacity like that.
Absolutely.
That's not some commitment from someone to lease it.
Yeah, that's always what I'm, when there's someone that said, hey, we're bringing 40 megawatts to the market, you go, okay, well, if we know it costs between 8 to, say, let's just be conservative, $10 million a megawatt.
Yeah.
You're like, so you're spending $400 million of speculative capacity to just sit out there.
It ain't what it used to be.
That's right. And so no one is going to do that today. They do it in a much more reasonable approach. And the good thing is, and I give a lot of credit to these companies. They have programs that work, right? If we're going to build to chase hyperscale users, we do know we have to bring in certain markets 18 megawatts like online at once or 12 megawatts online at once, because we know in a second that could be leased, and then we have no capacity and nothing coming online. That's one of the crazy things about our market in the last 3 to 5 years in certain cities, data center markets. You've had, I would say, like capacity that's set for a little bit, and then all of a sudden it's like the market changes overnight, and you go from there being 5 or 6 locations with maybe 10 or megawatts or more to really nothing in the market. And so it's just a cycle, and then the construction ramps up again, and you have several other projects, people come to the market, and then you kind of do the same thing. So it's to longer answer than you wanted, but that's typically how we take it from planned to under construction to commissioned and available.
Yeah, and so then, kind of the other headline number that we hear about a lot is absorption, which is the amount of growth that's happened in an industry. And again, there's some very important ways that we define that. So talk a little bit about how we measure that, and even specifically as far as how we physically go out or make phone calls and measure that information and get the information and how you define it.
Yeah, so we are trying to understand of like how much available capacity that's in a market over a time period, how much of that gets leased. And that's a great metric to understand like the demand in a market. So, we're always talking to data center operators now across the world, as well as, touring facilities and, doing kind of the boots on the ground work that it takes to really understand what's happening in a market. So we're always looking at that, how much is available and how much that's changed in a time period. We're also looking at how much pre-leasing gets done. So that's really important. So we choose at datacenterHawk to, try to be like, I think of like tip of the spear on when we understand deals get done. That's what we want to talk about as demand in the market right then, not necessarily in 9 to 12 months when they move into the space. One, that's really hard to track. And 2, it's more like backwards, tracking, and we like to, we're trying to be as real time as we can. Mm-hmm. So, and also too, if I'm going to spend, over $100 million in an investment or in a market, I want to know like the latest info, because that's really valuable to me. Whether they move in 6 months or 12 months, doesn't matter as much. So I think that's the pre-leasing thing with absorption has really changed the market. If you look at datacenterHawk's absorption numbers over the last 2 years, 60 to 70% of what's happened has been pre-leasing. And that shows how much, and it's been probably pre-leasing by 5 to 10 companies across the world, because their footprints have been so large anyway. And then you throw COVID and the challenges experienced with that, and that's only increased those numbers. So anyway, that's what we do to really track demand in the market. And I think it's, we do that in every facility, every quarter. And the other thing I would just mention on this, and I think we're coming into a time period in our industry where this will maybe have more of an impact than it's ever had before, because of how young our industry is, and that is like second generation space coming back to the market. So you have some areas in the U.S., maybe some in Europe, where data center facilities that were built 15 years ago with an anchor tenant that had 6 megawatts of power, that tenant or that customer over the last 5 years has decided to migrate out, or they're doing something bigger in another facility, and so you're having some capacity coming back online, and it's a second generation space, and so you have compressed rental rates in some different areas, and now this space is competing with like brand new campuses and facilities that have just been built. So there's an interesting dynamic that will impact the market with some of those larger footprints, and I think it's one that we'll have to watch. It could slow down development in certain markets, because if you're a data center operator and hey, I have 5 megawatts or 10 megawatts coming back here, just instead of going and just building the next building, you'd go, hey, we probably for the next 6 to 12 months need to focus on this before we are continuing to deliver supply.
Yeah, and that it will how we report on something like that could look very. It wouldn't show up a ton in our reporting.
Right.
One customer moves out, that one moves in. From
Right.
our standpoint, really nothing changed, and so that's a bit of an interesting. But as you mentioned, the rent that they might be paying on that second generation space could be lower.
Oh yeah,
which people will
yes,
want to
unfortunately.
know.
Yeah,
and it would certainly it would inform some of our pricing metrics. But if as far as a demand or growth standpoint, it is kind of gets a wash.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say too is like. One thing around pricing in our space that everybody needs to remember is that the product has changed significantly from 10, 15 years ago.
Think of like a cell phone.
Yeah.
It's a great analogy. How much has a cell phone changed in 15 years?
Yes. I mean, there's, and so I think the what you're buying today is different. The efficiencies are different. Those costs a lot of times are getting directly passed to the customer. So when we talk about like rates being compressed, part of it is because it's a different product today than it was 5-10 years ago.
Yeah. Okay, great thoughts on capacity, how we measure it, how we measure the changes in it. Anything else to add before we shut it down?
I just would say, I probably should have said this at the beginning, but I'll say it at the end. If you're in this space or you're trying to get in it and understand it, these are the basics for understanding. If you don't get this right, you're in trouble, because you have to know your framework. If you're going to go be a data center operator, be an investor in the market, be a consultant helping companies make big decisions, be even a company that's, putting IT infrastructure into the market. I mean, this is like the blocking and tackling that you need to know if you're going to understand how these markets grow. So I would just say getting a really good understanding of that is important. There's different places you can get that information. Certainly we're one of them, but there's other companies that track the market as well. And I would just say if you're doing any of that, you really just need to hammer home, what are we talking about here? When you say this is a 500 megawatt market, what do you mean? What are you asking? I mean, what is the universe within that? Multi-tenant data centers, hyperscale data centers, are like all the privately owned data centers in this. If JP Morgan Chase has a 200,000 square foot facility that's 20 megawatts, is that in here too? You just got to understand those things. But it is a fascinating part of this market, like how it's grown. And that's been the fun thing, I think, for us, is just looking at the numbers over the last year, but even the last like 5 years, to see how much this market has changed. And it will be fun. I'm thinking in 2025, like what our numbers will show and how, the last 10 to 15 years, the data center market has changed.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to keep an eye on, like you said, the continued like maturation of the industry. There's going to be like just some swings or things that are hard to predict. I mean, we couldn't have predicted 2020 and 2019 and, so on and so forth. So
yes,
we will continue to track it for you. Stay tuned for that. But again, like you mentioned, this is kind of the last in our initial Data Center Fundamental series. So if you haven't seen those, go to YouTube or our blog, and there's all those listed out. You can see some of the different other topics we've tackled. So check those out. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Otherwise, we will catch you next time.